Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Minnesota Senate Republican Minority Leader Mark Johnson. Senator, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you for making the time. It's great to be with you.
Your state has been making big news as of late. Vice President Kamala Harris officially tapped Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz, as her running mate. Before this grand announcement, Governor Walz really wasn't known. He wasn't a nationwide name, but you know him. You work with him closely. So can you talk to us about how he leads and what it's like working with Governor Walz?
For that question, I think it's interesting with Governor Walz, the way that he's coming across right now. People see him as somebody that's very middle of the road, kind of a compromising figure that would be able to bring both sides together. And when he was first elected as governor, we were actually pretty hopeful as Republicans that he was a governor that we could work with. Unfortunately, he's proved that he's somebody that's very one-dimensional. And that means, within his party he'll work, but anybody that's outside of that, he's very unwilling to compromise. And many instances where, Republicans who control, nearly half the state as far as the votes go. He has not engaged the way that you would anticipate, a governor reaching out and building those relationships. And it's been very disappointing that way as a leader to not have a relationship with the governor. So that's been very unproductive over here in Minnesota.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What specific instances did you want to work across the aisle? Did you bring up concerns to Governor Walz? And in your opinion, you feel those went unanswered? You feel that he was unwilling to work with you?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples. So as I've led the Minnesota Senate Republicans over the last 2 years here, there's been a lot of opportunities in different reforms, whether it's been in the business community as far as mandates are concerned, or with taxation, or with some of the social policy that we're looking at, where we have members that are very concerned about the direction that the Democrats were taking it. And there's opportunities to work together. We reached out with the House Republican leader and myself, trying to get those meetings to have some of that legislation really adjusted to work for our party, to work for theirs. But those calls went unanswered. And we had many attempts to try to sit down and meet and hammer these issues out. And yet we were just always ignored, always put off to the back burner during that time. And these are opportunities to really build those bridges amongst parties, amongst people. And he completely ignored those opportunities and left a really bad taste in the mouths of those who were trying to get work done for all of Minnesota.
To your point, the campaign is really painting him as this Midwestern dad who was able to work across the aisle. President Obama talked about his flannels during his speech. They're really leaning into that figure as someone who can bring both sides together. Do you think, or are you concerned rather, that with Walz on the ticket, they're going to attract more maybe disenfranchised Republicans, more moderates, more independents?
Well, for those who in Minnesota who really know who Governor Walz is, they know that he's not a moderate. We have some of the most extreme social policy that passed under his watch. Also, we're number one in income tax now when you look amongst the states. That includes states like New York and California. We know that we're more extreme in things like mandates, regulations on businesses, and that's why they are moving their production, their expansions outside of Minnesota. So he's a wolf in sheep's clothing if people think that he's a moderate that's going to be able to bring people together, because the reality is that he governs to the extreme left.
I want to talk about what his response was when asked about his very progressive record. This is what he said. "What a monster. Kids are eating and having full bellies so they can go learn, and women are making their own healthcare decisions." What do you make of his response when presented with his record and questions of what attacks and criticisms he would face from the right?
He recently made a comment that said something to the effect of, somebody's socialism is just my version of friendly. For him, what he does is he doubles down on taking from middle class, from people who are working families, and taking their wealth and then spreading it among the state. When you look at that, think about, we almost have $1 billion fraud under his watch. What he's doing is taking that money from middle-class families and giving it to agencies who are not being responsible with that money and wasting it among the states. So he has a couple of things that he'll point out, like free school lunches for children, things like that. But what he's ignoring is that a lot of the funding that he's taking from families and businesses is going into this fraud that's happened across the state. And there's a lot of things like that that we have to watch for. And so it's pretty disingenuous for him to throw out these few things without realizing or recognizing these shortcomings within his record as well.
Republicans are in the minority in the Minnesota Senate, but can you point to, under Governor Walz's leadership, his time as governor, any bipartisan legislative accomplishment that you're proud of that you worked with him at all or with other Democrats on?
There's been very few, actually, that we can say that we worked bipartisanly on over the last 2 years while I was leader of the Republican Party in the Senate. It's been, once they got the trifecta, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, really what they've done is they've ignored Republicans across the state. And remember, in the Minnesota Senate, we're only in the minority of one seat, and technically right now with the DFL members, Democrat members, resigning recently, we're at a tie. So, I mean, very, very close in both the House and the Senate. And if they continue to ignore the needs of nearly half of the state, and leaders and other members out in conversations. Now, they'll tote things like we had a bipartisan tax fix. Well, that was a tax bill that the Democrats ran in 2023 that had a lot of errors in it that we're continuing to point out throughout the legislative session. And then they realized that after the bill was passed, and then they had to go back for a correction, which we supported. So there's going to be things like that they will tout going forward. But the reality is there's been very little compromise going back and forth, especially over the last 2 years.
How do you think then his record would translate to a national stage under a Harris-Walz administration should they win in November?
What I'm very concerned about is that Governor Walz, and if they win, Vice President Walz, would be somebody that would go out and he talks a great game and he'll put it in terms that it sounds very benign on the programs that they're going to be implementing. But the reality is that he's going to be going hard to the left on all these issues. Think about things that are important to all Americans, like border security. Governor Walz, I'm sure, will put a good spin on it, but the reality is they're going to be soft on the border again and continue to keep it open in a way that endangers, the border states. Also, it builds up a lot of expense in states like Minnesota, where we have now free health care for illegal immigrants. And same with they can get driver's licenses and those sorts of things. I mean, it puts a burden on those states. But again, I think he's going to put a shine on these things. But the reality is it's going to be hard left policies.
He had the opportunity earlier this week to introduce himself on the national stage at the Democratic National Convention. He leaned into more of his experience as a coach, as a teacher. At the end of the speech, he was talking like Democrats were in the fourth quarter of a close game. How do you think that speech went? What were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, again, he gets into these speeches and he talks about football things, but the reality is it was very short on policy and actual substance that we're going to be doing. A lot of word salad that was coming out, but the reality is we don't know what they're going to be doing based on that speech. We do know based on his actions that he took in Minnesota. You think of things like the city of Minneapolis burning down after the George Floyd protests, the lack of leadership that happened during that time. That's what we're going to be seeing with Vice President Walz administration. It scares me to think about him being that close to the presidency based on the actions that happened here in Minnesota.
At the time of those protests, Governor Walz did face criticism for calling the National Guard, taking too long to call the National Guard. That was the criticism. Right after he did, a few days after, during a call with the governors in the country, then President Donald Trump applauded his response. What did you think of that praise there? Do you think that wasn't right? What do you make of that?
Just being on the ground and being around the area during that time, I don't know what Donald Trump was told or was said during that call, but the reality is that people on TV, the reporters and people on radio are saying, where's the leadership? Where's the governor? Where are the people that need to be stepping in at this point? I didn't see that for 3 days. And so no matter what President Trump had said at the time, for those of us who were here, we were looking for leadership, and it never came for those first 3 days.
To your point earlier on policy, criticisms from the DNC or about the DNC, criticisms about the Harris campaign so far is that it's a little light on policy, but high on vibes. The momentum seemingly is there according to the polls, because right now they are neck and neck with Trump, in some even ahead, and very competitive in battleground states. Do you think then that the Trump campaign from top down and even Republicans down ballot need to change their strategy at all because of this from now to November?
Well, I think, when we're looking at candidates, what we need is candidates that really match their districts well. And that's what I'm about here in Minnesota, is making sure that as we look for candidates, as we're recruiting people, that they're the type of people that fit the community, understand the needs of those communities. And I can't control things that happen on the federal level, and maybe it will cut one way or another. But what I'm concerned about is making sure that districts are represented by people who care about them and share those same interests. And we've done a really good job in the state of Minnesota as Republicans, getting those people recruited for those positions. So I'm feeling very confident, no matter what happens at the top level, that we will be very competitive in this state going forward.
Senator, I appreciate your perspective today, your insight. You're welcome back anytime. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it very much. You have a great day.